In 367 AD, one man made a decision that changed the course of human spiritual history forever. He was a bishop named Athanasius, and he sat down and wrote a letter that told every church in the Christian world exactly which texts were sacred and which ones needed to be destroyed. And they were destroyed, scrolls burned, libraries erased, entire lineages of thought wiped from the record as though they had never existed. But here is what historians discovered centuries later: not everything burned. Some texts were buried in clay jars in the Egyptian desert near a place called Nag Hammadi. And when those jars were cracked open in 1945, what came out of them shook the foundations of everything Western civilization thought it knew about Jesus, about creation, about God, and about a figure so powerful, so central to early Christian thought, that her very existence had to be erased before the official story could be told. Her name was Sophia, and this is the story they tried to bury. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you are going to understand something about the architecture of consciousness, the structure of reality, and the hidden feminine principle at the heart of creation that 2,000 years of institutional theology kept locked away. This is not speculation, this is archaeology. These are real texts, real scholars, real discoveries, and once you understand what they contain, you will never see the story of humanity the same way again. Let us, begin with what Sophia actually was in these ancient traditions, because the word itself is the first key. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, but not wisdom as a passive quality, not wisdom as an idea recorded in a book or carved into a temple wall. In the Gnostic texts recovered from Nag Hammadi, Sophia is a living divine being, an active cosmic intelligence, one of many beings called Aeons, who exist within what the Gnostics described as the pleroma, translated literally as the fullness. Picture the pleroma not as a physical location, but as the complete, undivided state of divine reality, pure being, pure unity, pure consciousness before any separation ever occurred. Within this fullness, Sophia holds a precise role. She is the emanation of creative intelligence, the principle of intuition, the bridge between the unknowable source of all existence, which the Gnostics called the monad, and the manifest world of form and experience. She is not a goddess in the mythological sense. She is something more specific than that. She is a principle of consciousness made personal, given a name, given a story, because the Gnostics understood something that modern cognitive science is only beginning to articulate. The deepest truths about reality cannot be conveyed through abstract philosophy alone. They have to be felt. They have to move through narrative. They have to be experienced in the body before they can be understood in the mind. Now, before we go further, there is a distinction in Gnostic cosmology that matters enormously and is almost always glossed over in casual treatments of this subject: the difference between Aeons and Archons. Aeons are the divine emanations within the pleroma, aspects of the monad's infinite nature that express themselves as distinct principles. Think of them as rays emanating from a single source of light, distinct, but inseparable from their origin. Archons are something entirely different. The Archons are the governing forces of the material world, created not by the monad but by the Demiurge, a being we will come to shortly, and their function in the Gnostic framework is to maintain the conditions that keep human consciousness operating below its full capacity, attached to the material world, unaware of its own divine origin. If you are familiar with the concept of unconscious psychological conditioning, the automatic patterns, fears, and reactive programs that run beneath conscious awareness, you already have an intuitive map of what the Gnostics meant by Archons. Not literal demons, structural forces of limitation. The architecture of a mind that has forgotten what it actually is. And this is where Sophia's story begins its descent, because Sophia does something that the pleroma did not anticipate. Dwelling within the fullness, surrounded by harmony and unity, she is overcome by a longing that the Apocryphon of John describes as a desire to comprehend the incomprehensible, to grasp the nature of the monad itself, the ultimate source that exists beyond all attributes, beyond all knowing, beyond even the capacity of the greatest divine intelligence to fully understand. She acts on this longing alone, without the consent of the divine totality. And what emerges from her solitary act of creation is something imperfect, something bearing the mark of her incomplete understanding. What she creates is the Demiurge, a being the text's name, Yaldabaoth, depicted through the symbol of a lion-faced serpent, a creature of enormous power, combined with profound ignorance. And the critical detail, the detail that unlocks the entire Gnostic worldview, is that Yaldabaoth does not know where he came from. He looks around at the incomplete reality he inhabits, and in his blindness declares himself the only God. The Apocryphon of John records his proclamation, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." And the Gnostics read that line and recognized it immediately. That, they said, is what power sounds like when it has forgotten its own origin. That is the voice of a mind so convinced of its own primacy that it cannot perceive what it cannot remember. Now here is where this ancient cosmological drama becomes directly relevant to your own experience, because the Gnostics were not writing about events that happened only in some distant mythological past. They were writing a map of the human psyche. Sophia's fall is a precise phenomenological description of the experience of separation, that every human being carries. The moment she acted in isolation, without connection to the greater whole, something fragmented, and that fragmentation produced the conditions for a world characterized by duality, by ignorance, by the persistent painful sensation of being cut off from something you cannot name, but have never stopped sensing. That ache of incompleteness, that recurring feeling that the ordinary world, for all its noise and activity, does not quite account for the full dimension of what you are. The Gnostics had a specific diagnosis for that feeling. They said, that is not pathology, that is not existential confusion. That is Sophia's signal, embedded in the very structure of the consciousness that emerged from her fall, reminding the soul of what it came from and what it has the potential to return to. But the story does not end with the fall, and this is where Gnostic theology moves from tragedy into something far more complex and ultimately more hopeful. In the text, known as Pistis Sophia, one of the most detailed Gnostic scriptures ever recovered, running to several hundred pages of dialogue, Sophia's experience in the lower realms is described in extraordinary detail. She describes the Archons, the oppressive forces of the material world pressing in around her. She describes the loss of her light, and she calls out not in passive resignation but in urgent, specific prayer to the light she knows exists above the level of her current experience. And the light descends. In the Christian Gnostic tradition, the being who descends to restore Sophia is the Logos, the divine principle of clarity and order, and in the form that reached the human world, the Logos appears as Christ, as Jesus. But the relationship between Jesus and Sophia in this tradition is nothing like what most people have been taught. They are not separate figures operating in parallel hierarchies. They are complementary expressions of the same divine reality. Pistis Sophia makes this explicit with a directness that the orthodox tradition could not absorb. Jesus refers to Sophia as his consort, as his partner in the light, not a subordinate, not a symbol, a partner. The feminine and masculine principles of divine intelligence, separated by the fall, finding their way back toward the reunion that restores wholeness. The Gnostics had a technical term for this pairing, this complementary union of divine principles. They called it Syzygy, which in Greek means yoke, the joining of two things that complete each other. In their cosmological framework, the divine does not exist as a solitary, self-contained singularity. The divine exists in relationship. Every Aeon in the pleroma has its counterpart. Wisdom requires the Logos to give it direction. The Logos requires Sophia's intuitive depth to give it life. Masculine and feminine not as biological categories, but as cosmic principles that together constitute wholeness and apart constitute the fragmented state of reality as we experience it. This is why the Gnostic tradition was so specifically threatening to a theology of singular divine authority. You cannot have a sole, unquestioned, masculine God at the center of a cosmology that begins with the premise that the divine itself exists fundamentally in relationship, in complementarity, in the sacred pairing of wisdom and word. The Syzygy had to be erased before the singular hierarchy could be installed, and so it was. Now here is the question that serious students of this material always eventually ask: is any of this actually connected to the scripture that the mainstream tradition preserved? Are there threads of Sophia in the Bible as it exists today? And the answer is more surprising than most people expect. The Gnostics did not invent the concept of Sophia from nothing. They were extending a tradition that runs through the oldest layers of Hebrew scripture. Open the book of Proverbs, chapter 8. Wisdom speaks in the first person. She describes herself as existing before the creation of the world, before the mountains were settled, before the earth itself existed. She says she was beside the Creator as a master craftsman, daily his delight, rejoicing before him always. This is not metaphor for an abstract quality. The Hebrew word used is chokmah, grammatically feminine, and she speaks as a presence, as an active participant in the act of creation itself. The wisdom of Solomon, still in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox canon, today describes her as a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God. In the New Testament, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians refers to Christ as the wisdom of God. The Gospel of Luke contains a passage wisdom is justified by all her children that reads like a fragment of a much older tradition briefly surfacing within the canonical text before disappearing again. The threads are there. The Gnostics followed them, and what they found when they followed them to their logical conclusion was not heresy. It was a coherent, sophisticated, internally consistent theology that predated the institutional church and would have produced a very different kind of Christianity had it been allowed to survive. And here is the historical reality that no serious scholar disputes. The suppression was deliberate and systematic. The process by which early Christianity consolidated into a single orthodox tradition was not a neutral selection of the most accurate or most ancient texts. It was a political and theological process driven by specific institutional interests, and it involved not just selecting certain texts as canonical, but actively ordering the destruction of others. The communities that maintained Sophia as central to their theology, Valentinian Gnostics, Sethian communities, the followers of texts like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary, were labeled heretical, their teachers expelled, their scriptures ordered burned. The Gospel of Philip, one of the texts recovered at Nag Hammadi, describes Mary Magdalene in terms that Gnostic scholars recognize immediately as connected to the Sophia tradition. She is depicted as the one who truly understands, the companion of the teacher, the one whose insight exceeds that of the other disciples. This was not a marginal interpretation. These were vibrant, theologically sophisticated communities that in many cases predated what eventually became Orthodox Christianity. They were not a deviation from the tradition. They were a branch of the tradition that was deliberately cut off so that the remaining branch could claim to be the only branch. So what does it mean practically, personally, in the actual texture of your daily life to recover this tradition? What is the lived significance of understanding Sophia not as a historical curiosity, but as a living principle? The Gnostic answer is precise and radical. It changes the entire diagnosis of the human condition. The mainstream theological tradition that shaped Western civilization located the source of human suffering in moral failure, in the concept of original sin, the idea that human beings are fundamentally broken, that our nature is corrupted, that we require external authority and institutional mediation to access the divine. The Gnostic tradition offers a completely different analysis. The source of human suffering is not moral failure. It is ignorance specifically, ignorance of what we actually are. Within every human being, the Gnostics believed, there exists a fragment of divine light, a spark of the original pleroma, the spiritual inheritance of the consciousness that emerged from Sophia's fall. The material world is not evil. The body is not a prison. Matter is not the enemy. The problem is not what we are made of. The problem is that we have forgotten what we are. And Gnosis, direct experiential recognition of the divine spark within, not as belief or doctrine, but as immediate, undeniable knowing, is the correction. Not salvation dispensed by an institution, not forgiveness granted by an authority. Direct knowing, internal recognition, the remembering of what was never actually lost, only forgotten. There is one final dimension of Sophia's story that deserves your complete attention because it is, in the end, the most personally relevant thing in everything we have covered today. The Gnostics describe Sophia as having a dual nature. When she falls, she does not fall entirely. A part of her, what the texts call higher Sophia, remains in the pleroma, undiminished, in perfect union with the divine totality, untouched by the conditions of the material world. But the part of her that descended lower Sophia is not presented as a broken or damaged version of herself. She is the aspect of wisdom that chose to enter experience, that chose to know the material world from the inside, that chose, in some sense impossible to fully comprehend, to become subject to separation. In order to understand what separation feels like, and therefore to understand what is needed for the souls caught in separation to find their way back. This distinction between higher Sophia and lower Sophia is the Gnostic answer to one of the oldest and most painful questions in human spirituality. Why does consciousness experience suffering at all? Why does a divine source allow the experience of separation to exist? And the answer the Gnostics offer refuses both easy comfort and cheap nihilism. Descent is not punishment. Separation is not a mistake to be corrected by returning to an untested state of unconscious unity. The experience of being finite, embodied, temporarily disconnected from the infinite, this is what produces the kind of wisdom that could not exist in the pleroma before Sophia fell. The wisdom that has been tested by experience. The wisdom that knows loss, knows longing, knows the specific weight of what it feels like to be far from home. This is not the wisdom of pure theory. This is wisdom that has paid for itself, and the Gnostic texts are unanimous on how the story ends. Sophia is restored. She returns to the pleroma, but she returns changed, and the change is not a blemish on her restoration. It is the point of the entire journey. She returns as something the pleroma did not contain before she fell, wisdom that has experienced what it means to be separated from the source and found the way back. Wisdom that can serve as the bridge between the divine realm and the human condition because she knows both from the inside. The Gnostic tradition describes this returned Sophia as the guide for human souls, making the same journey she made: descent, struggle, awakening, return. She is not above the process looking down. She is within it, having walked it fully, pointing the direction that only someone who has actually walked it can reliably point. 2,000 years ago, certain communities of human beings possessed an understanding of consciousness, of the relationship between the individual soul and the source, of all existence that was sophisticated enough to survive 17 centuries of intentional erasure and still make sense when it resurfaced. Their texts were burned, their teachers were expelled, their insights were classified as heresy and sealed into clay jars in the Egyptian desert. And then, in 1945, a man broke open one of those jars and found something that had been waiting with extraordinary patience for the conditions that would allow it to be received. The story came back, because certain truths, it seems, are not the kind that can be permanently buried. They wait, they survive. They surface again when the consciousness encountering them is ready not just to read them, but to recognize them. If something in this video landed somewhere deeper than your intellect, if at any point you felt less, like you were encountering new information, and more like you were remembering something you already knew, I want you to sit with that for a moment before you scroll to the next thing. The Gnostics had a word for that experience. They called it anamnesis, the opposite of amnesia, not learning, remembering. If that is what you felt, then you already understand more about Sophia than most people who have spent years studying the academic history. Leave me a comment below. I genuinely want to know what specifically landed for you, what felt like recognition rather than information. The next video in this Quantum Awareness series covers the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and what it reveals about the role of the feminine in early Christianity that the 4 canonical Gospels were specifically edited to obscure. Subscribe so you do not miss it, and until then keep questioning what you were taught. The jars are still being opened.
I personally researched, wrote and prepared this video to bring your accurate and meaningful content. Subscribe for more original content.